Lavinia says, "Bravo, Edward! This is surprising. Now, who could have taught you to answer back like that?" Edward says, "I have had quite enough humiliation lately to bring me to the point at which humiliation ceases to humiliate. You get to the point at which you cease to feel, and then you speak your mind." Lavinia says, "That will be a novelty, to find that you have a mind to speak. Anyway, I'm prepared to take you as you are." Edward says, "You mean you are prepared to take me as I was, or as you think I am? But what do you think I am?" Lavinia says, "Oh, what you always were. As for me, I'm rather a different person who you must get to know." Edward says, "This is very interesting, but you seem to assume that you've done all the changing, though I haven't yet found it a change for the better. But it doesn't occur to you that possibly I may have changed too." Lavinia says, "Oh, Edward, when you were a little boy, I'm sure you were always getting yourself measured to prove how you had grown since the last holidays. You were always intensely concerned with yourself, and if other people grow, well, you want to grow too. In what way have you changed?" Edward says, "The change that comes from seeing oneself through the eyes of other people." Lavinia says, "That must have been very shattering for you, but never mind, you'll soon get over it and find yourself another little part to play with another face to take people in." Edward says, "One of the most infuriating things about you has always been your perfect assurance that you understood me better than I understood myself." Lavinia says, "And the most infuriating thing about you has always been your placid assumption that I wasn't worth the trouble of understanding." Edward says, "So here we are again, back in the trap, with only one difference, perhaps. We can fight each other, instead of taking his corner of the cage each." "Well, it's a better way of passing the evening than listening to the gramophone." Lavinia says, "We have very good records, but I always suspected that you really hated music, and that the gramophone was your only escape from talking to me when we had to be alone." Edward says, "I've often wondered why you married me." Lavinia says, "Well, you really were quite attractive, you know. And you kept on saying that you were in love with me. I believe you were trying to persuade yourself that you were. I seemed always on the verge of some wonderful experience, and then it never happened. I wonder now how you could have thought you were in love with me." Well, people think they're in love, and it turns out to be the body, without character or spirit or something back up the this bodily attraction or the status thing or wealth. Edward says, "Everybody told me that I was, and they told me how well suited we were." Lavinia says, "It's a pity that you had no opinion of your own. Oh, Edward, I should like to be good to you." Funny way of expressing that, but if that's impossible, at least be horrid to you. Anything but nothing, which is all you seem to want of me. But I'm sorry for you." You have counter people that think they can respond to people like this, and it's like, you're not going to get, it's like in high school, people calling each other, "Oh, you're a loser because you're not part of our clique," and you hear that being said to people all over the place, and you're like, Edward says, "Don't say you were sorry for me. I've had enough of people being sorry for me." Lavinia says, "Yes, because they can never be so sorry for you as you are for yourself. And that's hard to bear. I thought that there might be some way out for you. If I went away, I thought that if I died to you, I, who had been only a ghost to you, you might be able to find the road back to a time when you were real, for you must have been real, at some time or another, before you ever knew me, perhaps only when you were a child. Edward says, I don't want you to make yourself responsible for me. It's only another kind of contempt, and I don't want you to explain me to myself. You're still trying to invent a personality for me, which will only keep me away from myself. Lavinia says, You're complicating what is in fact very simple. But there is one point which I see clearly. We are not to relapse into the kind of life we led until yesterday morning. Well, she was holding in her, what's the way to say this? It's not swearing. Irritability, yes, irritability. Edward says, There was a door, and I could not open it. Now, you don't have to lie about it. You just don't have to be unkind to people. Edward says, There was a door, and I could not open it. I could not touch the handle. Why could I not walk out of my prison? What is hell? Hell is oneself. Hell is alone, the other figures in it, merely projections. There is nothing to escape from and nothing to escape to. One is always alone. Lavinia says, Edward, what are you talking about? Talking to yourself. Could you bear for a moment to think about me? Yeah, when you're talking to people, you need to listen and then respond accordingly. But we know, this is about somebody being rude, about, not loving the person, but some fantasy, which most people fall into. So Edward says, It was only yesterday that damnation took place, and now I must live with it day by day, hour by hour, forever and ever. Lavinia says, I think you're on the edge of a nervous breakdown. Edward says, Don't say that. Lavinia says, I must say it. I know of a doctor who could help you. And one of the things in the Islamic world, when there's marital problems and it's something where it has to be dealt with just other than the couple talking and separating, that sort of stuff, each party takes a side. Marriage counseling tends to have some marriage counselor that takes a side of somebody, and if she knows a person, you pretty much know what side that's going to be. Edward says, If I go to a doctor, I shall make my own choice, not take one whom you choose. How do I know that you wouldn't see him first and tell him all about me from your point of view? But I don't need a doctor. I am simply in hell, where there are no doctors, at least not in a professional capacity. Lavinia says, One can be practical, even in hell, and you know that I'm much more practical than you are. Well, men and women are practical in different ways, as a rule, but Edward says, I ought to know by now what you consider practical. Practical, I remember on our honeymoon. You were always wrapping things up in tissue paper, and then had to unwrap everything again to find what you wanted. And I could never teach you how to put the cap on a tube of toothpaste. Lavinia says, Very well, then. I shall not try to press you. You're much too divided to know what you want. But being divided, you will tend to compromise, and your sort of compromise will be the old one. Edward says, You don't understand me. Have I not made it clear that in the future you will find me a different person? Lavinia says, Indeed. Anne, has the difference nothing to do with Celia going to California? Edward says, Celia going to California? Lavinia says, Yes, with Peter. Really, Edward, if you were human, you'd burst out laughing, but you won't. Edward says, oh God, if I could return to yesterday. Yeah, when family's not being good to you, calling upon God is important. If I could return to yesterday, before I thought that, I had made a decision. What devil left the door on the latch? For these doubts to enter, and that you came back. You, the angel of destruction, just as I felt sure, in a moment, at your touch. There is nothing but ruin. Oh God, what have I done? The python, the octopus? Must I become, after all, what you would make me? Lavinia says, Well, Edward, I am unable to make you laugh, as I can't persuade you to see a doctor. There's nothing else at present I can do about it. I ought to go and have a look in the kitchen. I know there are some eggs, but we must go out for dinner. Meanwhile, my luggage is in the hall downstairs. Will you get the porter to fetch it up for me? And then the curtain is drawn, and there's a chemical reaction, I guess, that happens to people. And this chemical reaction is related to those 3 reasons for a person to get married that aren't character. Act 2. Sir Henry Harcourt, Riley's consulting room in London. It's morning, several weeks later. Sir Henry's alone at his desk. He presses an electric button. The nurse secretary enters with an appointment book. Riley says, "About those 3 appointments this morning, Miss Barroway, I should like to run over my instructions again. You'll understand, of course, that it is important to avoid any meeting." The nurse secretary says, "You've made that clear, Sir Henry. The first appointment at 11 o'clock, he is to be shown into the small waiting room, and you will see him almost at once." Riley says, "I shall see him at once." And the second? Nurse secretary says, "The second to be shown into the other room, just as usual. She arrives at 1:15, but you may keep her waiting." Riley says, "Or she may keep me waiting, but I think she will be punctual." The nurse secretary says, "I telephone through the moment she arrives and leave her there until you ring 3 times." Riley says, "And the third patient?" Nurse secretary says, "The third one to be shown in the small room, and I need not tell you that she has arrived. Then when you ring, I show the others out, and only after they have left the house." Riley says, "Quite right, Miss Barroway, and that's all for the moment." The nurse secretary says, "Miss Gibbs is here, Sir Henry. Ask him to come straight in." And the nurse secretary exits, and Alex enters and says, "When is Chamberlain's appointment?" Riley says, "At 11 o'clock. The conventional hour. We have not much time. Tell me now, how did you have any difficulty in convincing him I was the man for the case?" Alex says, "Difficulty? No. He was only impatient at having to wait 4 days for the appointment." Riley says, "It was necessary to delay his appointment to lower his resistance. But what I mean is, does he trust your judgment?" Alex says, "Yes, implicitly. But it's not that he regards me as very intelligent, but he thinks I'm well informed, the sort of person who would know the right doctor as well as the right shops. Besides, he is ready to consult any doctor, recommended by anyone except his wife." Riley says, "I had already impressed upon her that she was not to mention my name to him." Alex says, "With your usual foresight, now he's quite triumphant, because he thinks he's stolen a march on her. And when you've sent him to a sanatorium where she can't get at him, then he believes she will be very penitent. He's enjoying his illness." Riley says, "Illness offers him a double advantage, to escape from himself and get the better of his wife." Alex says, "Not to escape from her?" Riley says, "He doesn't want to escape from her. He's staying at his club." Riley says, "Yes, that's where he wrote from." The house telephone rings. "Yes. Hello. Show him up." Alex says, "You will have a busy morning. I will go out by the service staircase and come back when they've gone." Riley says, "Yes, when they've gone." Alex exits by the side door. Edward is shown in by the nurse secretary. Edward says, "Sir Henry Harcourt, Riley," and stops and stares at Riley. Riley, without looking up from his papers, "Good morning, Mr. Chamberlain. Please sit down. I won't keep you a moment. Now, Mr. Chamberlain." And, all this is kind of like that series, Mentalist. The Mentalist, there was something in the first season that I saw that I didn't remember by the last season. And after the last season exposed something, I was like, oh, Yeah, that's the only thing that makes sense with that scene. You know, so Edward says, it came into my mind before I entered the door that you might be the same person, but I dismissed that as just another symptom. Well, I should have known better than to come here on the recommendation of a man who didn't know you. Yet Alex is so plausible, and his recommendations of shops I have always been satisfactory. I beg your pardon, but he is a blunderer. I should like to know. But what is the use? I suppose I might as well go away at once. Riley says, no, if you please, sit down, Mr. Chamberlain. You are not going away, so you might as well sit down. You were going to ask a question, Edward says. When you came to my flat, had you been invited by my wife as a guest, as I supposed, or did she send you? Riley says, I cannot say that I had been invited, and Miss Chamberlain did not know that I was coming, but I knew you would be there, and whom I should find with you. Edward says, but you had seen my wife? Riley says, oh yes, I had seen her. Edward says, so this is a trap. Riley says, let's not call it a trap, but if it is a trap, then you cannot escape from it. And so, you might as well sit down. I think that you will find that chair comfortable. Edward says, you knew before I began to tell you what had happened. Riley says, that is so. But all in good time. Let us dismiss that question for a moment. Tell me first about the difficulties on which you want my professional opinion. Edward says, it's not for me to blame you for bringing my wife back, I suppose. You seem to be trying to persuade me that I was better off without her. But didn't you realize that I was in no state to make a decision? Riley says, if I had not brought your wife back, Mr. Chamberlain, do you suppose that things would be any better now? Riley says, I don't know, I'm sure. They could hardly be worse. Riley says, they might be much worse. You might have ruined 3 lives by your indecision. Now there are only 2, which you still have the chance of redeeming from ruin. Edward says, you talk as if I was capable of action. If I were, I should not need to consult you or anyone else. I came here as a patient. If you take no interest in my case, I can go elsewhere. Riley says, you have reason to believe that you are very ill. Edward says, I should have thought a doctor could see that for himself, or at least that he would inquire about the symptoms. 2 people advised me recently, almost in the same words, that I ought to see a doctor. They said again, in almost the same words, that I was on the edge of a nervous breakdown. I didn't know it then myself, but if they saw it, I should have thought that a doctor could see it. Riley says, a nervous breakdown is a term I never use. It can mean almost anything, Edward says, and since then I have realized that mine is a very unusual case. Riley says, all cases are unique and very similar to others. Edward says, is there a sanatorium to which you send such patients as myself under your personal observation? Riley says, you are very impetuous, Mr. Chamberlain. There are several kinds of sanatoria for several kinds of patient, and there are also patients for whom a sanatorium is the worst place possible. We must first find out what is wrong with you before we decide what to do with you. Edward says, I doubt if you have ever had a case like mine. I have ceased to believe my own personality. Riley says, oh dear, yes, this is serious, a very common malady, very prevalent indeed. Edward says, I remember in my childhood. Riley says, I always begin from the immediate situation and then go back as far as necessary. You see, your memories of childhood. I mean, your present state of mind would be largely fictitious. And as for your dreams, you would produce amazing dreams to oblige me. I could make you dream any kind of dream I suggested, and would only go to flatter your vanity with temporary stimulus of feeling interesting. Says Riley. And yeah, people can program their dreams in, particularly in a psychological setting or an occult setting. And then, of course, the psychiatrist or the cult leaders are going to, have their sense of power over and responding to Eckankar, the New Age religion, is the playlist where I talk about that more. Edward says, but I am obsessed by the thought of my own insignificance. Riley says, precisely. and I could make you feel important, and you would imagine it a marvelous cure, and you would go on doing such amount of mischief as lay within your power until you came to grief. Half of the harm that is done in this world is due to people who want to feel important. They don't mean to do harm, but the harm does not interest them, or they do not see it, or they justify it, because they are absorbed in the endless struggle to think well of themselves. Edward says, if I am like that, I must have done a great deal of harm. Riley says, oh, not so much as you would like to think. Only, shall we say, within your modest capacity. Try to explain what has happened since I left you. Edward says, I now see why I wanted my wife to come back. It was because of what she had made me into. We had not been alone again for 15 minutes before I felt, and still more acutely, indeed acutely perhaps for the first time, the whole oppression, the unreality of the role she had always imposed upon me, with the obstinate, unconscious, subhuman strength that some women have. Without her, it was vacancy. When I thought she had left me, I began to dissolve, to cease to exist. That was what she had done to me. I cannot live without her. That is now intolerable. I cannot live with her, for she has made me incapable of having an existence of my own. That is what she has done to me in 5 years together. She has made the world a place I cannot live in, except on her terms. I must be alone, but not in the same world. So I want you to put me into your sanatorium. I could be alone there. The house telephone rings, and every other person says that some woman drove them crazy or something, but that's not quite the answer. Perhaps a controlled retreat. Riley speaks into the telephone saying yes, and then to Edward he says, yes, you could be alone there. Edward says, I wonder if you have understood a word of what I have been saying. Riley says, you must have patience with me, Mr. Chamberlain. I learn a good deal by merely observing you and letting you talk as long as you please, and taking note of what you do not say. Edward says, I once experienced the extreme of physical pain, and now I know there is suffering worse than that. It is surprising if one had time to be surprised. I'm not afraid of the death of the body, but this death is terrifying, the death of the spirit. Can you understand what I suffer? Riley says, I understand what you mean. Edward says, I can no longer act for myself. Coming to see you, that's the last decision I was capable of making. I am in your hands. I cannot take any further responsibility. Riley says, many patients come in that belief. Edward says, and now will you send me to the sanatorium? Riley says, you have nothing else to tell me? Edward says, what else can I tell you? You didn't want to hear about my early history. Riley says, no, I did not want to hear about your early history. Edward says, and so you will send me to the sanatorium? I can't go home again. And at my club, they won't let you keep a room for more than 7 days. I haven't the courage to go to a hotel. And besides, I need more shirts. You can get my wife to have my things sent on, whatever I shall need. But of course you mustn't tell her where I am. Is it far to go? Riley says, you might say a long journey, but before I treat a patient like yourself, I need to know a great deal more about him than a patient himself can always tell me. Indeed, it is often the case that my patients are only pieces of a total situation, which I have to explore. The single patient who was ill by himself is rather the exception. I have recently had another patient whose situation is much the same as yours, and presses the bell on his desk 3 times. You must accept a rather unusual procedure. I propose to introduce you to the other patient. Edward says, what do you mean? Who is the other patient? I consider this very unprofessional conduct. I will not discuss my case before another patient. Riley says, on the contrary, that is the only way in which it can be discussed. You have told me nothing. You have had the opportunity, and you have said enough to convince me that you have been making up your case, so to speak, as you went along, a barrister ought to know his brief before he enters the court. Edward says, I am at least free to leave, and I propose to do so. My mind is made up. I shall go to a hotel. It is just because you are not free, Mr. Chamberlain, that you have come to me. It is for me to give you that, your freedom. That is my affair. Lavinia is shown in by the nurse secretary, but here is the other patient. Edward says, Lavinia? Lavinia says, well, Sir Henry, I said I would come to talk about my husband. I didn't say I was prepared to meet him. Edward says, and I did not expect to meet you, Lavinia. And I call this a very dishonorable trick. Raleigh says, honesty before honor, Mr. Chamberlain. Sit down, please, both of you, Mr. Chamberlain. Your husband wishes to enter a sanatorium, and that is a question which naturally concerns you. Edward says, I'm not going to any sanatorium. I'm going to a hotel, and I shall ask you, Lavinia, to be so good as to send me on some clothes. Lavinia says, oh, to what hotel? Edward says, I don't know. I mean to say that doesn't concern you. Lavinia says, in that case, Edward, I don't think your clothes concern me either. And then speaks to Riley. I presume you will send him to the same sanatorium to which you sent me. Well, he needs it more than I did. Riley says, I'm glad that you have come to see it in that light, at least for the moment. But Miss Chamberlain, you have never visited my sanatorium. Lavinia says, what do you mean? I asked to be sent, and you took me there. If that was not a sanatorium, what was it? Riley says, a kind of hotel, a retreat for people who imagine they need respite from everyday life. They return refreshed, and they believe it to be a sanatorium. That is a good reason for not sending them to one. The people who need my sort of sanatorium are not easily deceived. Lavinia says, are you a devil or merely a lunatic practical joker? Edward says, I incline to the second explanation, without the qualification lunatic. Why should you go to a sanatorium? I have never known anyone in my life with fewer mental complications than you. You're stronger than a battleship. That's what drove me mad. And I'm the one who needs a sanatorium. But I'm not going there, Riley says. You are right, Miss Chamberlain. You are no case for my sanatorium. You're much too ill, Edward says. Much too ill? Then I'll go and be ill in a suburban boarding house. Lavinia says, that would never suit you, Edward. Now I know of a hotel in the New Forest. Edward says, how like you, Lavinia? You always know something better, Lavinia says. It's only that I have a more practical mind than you have, Edward. You do know that, Edward says, only because you told me so often. I'd like to see you filling up an income tax form. Lavinia says, don't be silly, Edward. When I say practical, I mean practical in the things that really matter. Raleigh says, may I interrupt this interesting discussion, brought on by, the place of feminism is denied, the importance of downplayed certain roles, even downplayed the male view of females. And Raleigh's still talking here. I say you are both too ill. I interrupted with a comment, but I see you are both too ill. There are several symptoms which must occur together, and to a marked degree, to qualify a patient for my sanatorium, and one of them is an honest mind. That is one of the causes of their suffering. Well, the fact they're not being direct with themselves and all that stuff, dishonesty, that causes prefrontal cortex problems. Lavinia says, no one can say my husband has an honest mind, Edward says. And I could not honestly say that of you, Lavinia. Raleigh says, I congratulate you both on your perspicacity. Your sympathetic understanding of each other. I will prepare you to appreciate what I have to say to you. Do not trouble myself with the common cheat or with insuperably innocently dull. My patients, such as you are the self-deceivers, taking infinite pains, exhausting their energy, yet never quite successful. You have both of you pretended to be consulting me, both tried to impose upon me your own diagnosis, and prescribe your own cure. But when you put yourself into hands like mine, you surrender a great deal more than you meant to. This is the consequence of trying to lie to me. Lavinia says, I did not come here to be insulted. Riley says, you have come where the word insult has no meaning, and you must put up with that. All that you have told me, both of you, is true enough. You described your feelings. Are some of them, admitting the important facts? Let me take your husband first, Edward. You were lying to me by concealing your relations with Miss Copplestone. Edward said, this is monstrous. My wife knew nothing about it. Lavinia says, really, Edward? If I'd been blind, there were plenty of people to let me know about it. I wonder if there was any one who didn't know, Riley says. That was one, in fact, but you, Miss Chamberlain, tried to make me believe that it was this discovery precipitated what you called your nervous breakdown. Well, if there was no affair, people need to calm themselves. Lavinia says, but it is true. I was completely prostrated, even if I have made a partial recovery. Riley says, certainly, you were completely prostrated, and certainly you have somewhat recovered. But you failed to mention that the cause of your distress was the defection of your lover, who suddenly, for the first time in his life, fell in love with someone, and with someone of whom you had reason to be jealous. Edward says, really, Lavinia, this is very interesting. You seem to have been much more successful at concealment than I was. Now I wonder who it could have been. Lavinia says, well, tell him if you like. Riley says, a young man named Peter. Edward says, Peter? Peter who? Riley says, Mr. Peter Quope was a frequent guest. Edward says, Peter Quope? Peter Quope? Really, Lavinia? I congratulate you. You could not have chosen anyone I was less likely to suspect. And then he came to me to confide about Celia. I have never heard anything so utterly ludicrous. This is the best joke that ever happened. Lavinia says, I never knew you had such a sense of humor. Riley says, it is the first more hopeful symptom. Lavinia says, how did you know all this? Riley says, that I cannot disclose. I have my own method of collecting information about my patients. You must not ask me to reveal it. That is a matter of professional etiquette. Lavinia says, I have not noticed much professional etiquette about your behavior today. Riley says, a point well taken, but permit me to remark that my revelation about each of you to one another have not been anything that you confided to me. The information I have exchanged between you was all obtained from outside sources. Miss Chamberlain, when she came to me 2 months ago, I was dissatisfied with your explanation and your obvious symptoms of emotional strain, so I made inquiries.